the woman knows that, and she knows it for sure, and she could tell anyone, any supervisor, any manager of her workplace, that this is going to have a violent end if they don't act. Yet this bill, Bill 168, doesn't capture that. It doesn't give her recourse. In fact, if anything, it gives the management recourse of where she works to say, well, you know, everybody's allowed on the TTC. You could say the same to Laurie DuPont. You know, a doctor is allowed in the hospital. You could say the same to Teresa Vince. Well, it's a manager. He's just trying to be nice. He's just phoning you. He's just buying you coffee. He's just offering you presents. Management, with the way Bill 168 is worded, has that out. They have the out to say, well, you know, he's just being friendly. Now, for all of the women, and I know there isn't a woman alive, you know, the stats say something like 1 in 2 women has experienced harassment, the kind of harassment that should be captured by Bill 168. Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I've never met a woman who has not been harassed at some point in her life by somebody, some unwanted attention. Now, for the vast majority of women, of course, it does not become deadly the way it did for Laurie DuPont or the way it did for Teresa Vince. But every woman knows what constitutes stalking in her own situation, what constitutes undesirable behavior to the point that authorities should be notified so that management should protect her. Every woman knows that. Every woman. I mean, and both Teresa Vince and Laurie DuPont tried to wake people up, tried to say there's a problem here. Do something. Do something. And I understand that the government even recognizes that. I mean, otherwise they would not have gone through the effort of bringing Bill 168 to the floor of this Assembly. They understand as well that something has to happen to protect women like Laurie and Teresa. But the problem is with the wording in the bill, it doesn't. The second thing, and I talked about it, was stalking. A series of actions needed to be captured, as well as an extension of the definition of violence. But also, finally, the ability to remove oneself to a safe place. Unfortunately, and I really mean unfortunately, this bill does not capture that. I mean, the wording of the bill could have been written by a manager. Well, you can remove yourself from an unsafe place as long as you don't leave work. Well, imagine what that meant for Teresa Vince or Laurie DuPont. Imagine what that means for someone who sees the stalking behavior, who knows that this is escalating behavior, who knows that it starts with the phone calls, with the coffee, with the presents, then the phone calls increase. Then the harassment increases. They know, and anyone who works with women in terms of violence and abuse knows that this is a pattern that ensues, and knows that the woman has to make herself safe at any cost when she recognizes that this pattern is escalating. So what does that look like? Well, for a nurse, it looks like getting somewhere away from the person, and Laurie didn't have that opportunity. And for Teresa, it looks like getting away from the person, but Teresa didn't have that opportunity. And quite frankly, one can see the same situation emerge even after the passage of Bill 168, because a woman might say to her manager, I don't feel safe. And the manager could say, well, why not? Say, well, this, reaming off the countless behaviors, all of them in and of themselves not dangerous, all of them in and of themselves not constituting violence, all of them in and of themselves not covered by Bill 168, and say, I really think, picture that woman alone at night on the TTC with her stalker sitting right across from her, a paying customer. It's his right to be there. Paying customer, it's a public service. Laurie DuPont, doctor's right to be there, it's a hospital. Teresa Vince, it's a manager's right to be there, it's his workplace too. Imagine them appealing to someone within their company and saying, I don't feel safe. I just don't feel safe, and here's why, and I need to get somewhere safe, and somewhere safe is in this streetcar, is in this hospital, is in this office at Sears. It might be far away, Mr. Speaker. It might be a shelter. It might be home. It might be somewhere where they can get a restraining order. It might involve police, but whatever it is, chances are it's not around the workplace. Chances are it isn't. And that's supposedly what Bill 168 is supposed to be about, is protecting that woman in her workplace. But it's not limited. It doesn't mean she has to stay in her workplace to be protected. It means she needs to get somewhere safe so she's not killed. You know, again, the devil is in the details. In this case, the death, Mr. Speaker, is in the details. The death is in the details. The death not only of Laurie DuPont and Teresa Vince, but of every single one of those tragic statistics across the country. One looks back and wonders if there were any little details, probably none of them violent in and of themselves, that pinpointed to Mark Lapine and the people who were around him that something really tragic was about to ensue with that young man. I imagine there were. I imagine there were all sorts of little things, little behaviors, you know, little statements, little actions that in and of themselves weren't particularly frightening, but added together really made for a totally terrifying outcome. We heard on the Bill 168 committee, despite the truncated time, despite the silencing of some of the voices that wanted to come forward, we heard from unions, we heard from the families of Teresa Vince and Laurie DuPont, we heard from the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. In fact, kudos to them for all they've been through, and they brought forward some wonderful suggestions as amendments. Amendments, as I say, that were mirrored and reflected in the New Democratic Party's amendments, none of which were accepted by the government. Let me say that again. None of which were accepted by the government. None of the RNAO's suggestions for amendments were adopted by this government. One of the amendments they brought forward was to look at the very, this is quite revolutionary in a sense, because this is starting to speak, Mr. Speaker, to the very roots of violence against women in the workplace. And one of the RNAO's suggestion was to look at the medical advisory committees and the way they're made up. Like, why are they only doctors? Imagine if you are a nurse and your abuser, harasser is a doctor, and the committee you have to go to appeal to is nothing but doctors. Doesn't even make sense for patient care, and that's what RNAO was saying. They would like to see nurses on that committee. They'd like to see dietitians, and they'd like to see that committee reflect the fullness of the reality of hospital health care. It doesn't, a suggestion. You know, again,